This photograph was taken in the early 1850s, in a time when the American West was still a dangerous frontier of hunger, hope, and hardship. At first glance, it looks like any other faded portrait from the daguerreotype era. A young woman seated formally, her gaze fixed firmly on the lens. But look closer. Across her chin and mouth, a deep blue tattoo cuts starkly against pale skin, a mark that made her one of the most mysterious figures of her century. Her name was Olive Oatman. This single image, preserved in the archives of history, is unlike any other portrait of a pioneer woman. In an era when tattoos were nearly unheard of among white Americans, especially women, Olive's appearance shocked the nation. Her story was whispered in churches, discussed in parlors, and written about in newspapers from coast to coast. She became known as the branded girl, the white child marked with the symbols of another world. But the truth behind this photograph is far stranger and more haunting than a mere image can convey. It is a story born of violence and survival, of captivity and cultural collision, of identity torn between two worlds. It is a tale that forces us to ask, what does it mean to belong? And can a single image preserve a wound that never healed? To understand the mystery of Olive Oatman, we must return to the middle of the 19th century, a time when America was expanding westward with relentless force. Families left everything behind, crossing rivers, deserts, and mountains in search of new beginnings. For many, the promise of land and faith outweighed the dangers that lurked along the trail. For the Oatman family, that decision would lead to tragedy, survival, and a legacy that history still struggles to explain. And so, tonight, we will walk through the deserts of Arizona, across the blood-soaked trails of westward migration, and into the heart of one of the strangest survival stories ever recorded. Along the way, we will uncover the layers of myth, fear, and memory that turned a teenage girl into a national symbol. Before we begin, I want to invite you, if you find stories like this compelling, if you are fascinated by history's hidden mysteries and the haunting images it leaves behind, please subscribe, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share your perspective. What do you see when you look into Olive Oatman's eyes in that faded photograph? Does it feel like survival, sorrow, or something much harder to define? The answer may depend not only on history, but on what we are willing to confront in ourselves. To truly understand Olive Oatman's fate, we must first step into the America of the 1,840 seconds and 1,850 seconds. It was a land restless with expansion, a nation that had barely settled its own Civil War scars and was now consumed by dreams of manifest destiny. The belief that God had ordained the United States to spread from ocean to ocean drove families, churches, and entire communities to uproot themselves, chasing promises of fertile soil and a new Eden in the West. But that promise was cruelly deceptive. The journey westward was long and punishing. The deserts of the Southwest held no mercy for the unprepared. Hunger, thirst, disease, and hostile encounters shadowed every wagon train. For every family that found new farmland, there were countless graves scattered along the trails, tiny wooden markers standing lonely against endless sky. The Oatman family belonged to a religious sect, one of many Mormon splinter groups seeking to establish their own version of Zion. Like other believers, they trusted that faith and determination would protect them from danger. Their leader, Royce Oatman, was a man of stern conviction. He believed that the desert, no matter how inhospitable, could be transformed into a place of divine reward. It was this conviction that would lead his family deeper and deeper into peril. The West in those years was not an empty canvas waiting for settlers. It was already inhabited by Native American tribes whose histories stretched back centuries. Apache, Yavapai, and Mohave peoples all lived across the deserts and river valleys that pioneers sought to cross. To these tribes, the arrival of wagon trains often meant invasion, loss, and bloodshed. And to the settlers, every shadow on the horizon was a potential enemy. Fear and misunderstanding poisoned every encounter. The land itself seemed designed to test human endurance. Vast stretches of desert offered no shade, no water, only heat that seared the skin and cracked the lips of those who dared cross. When storms did come, they struck with sudden violence, flooding canyons and tearing apart camps. At night, The silence of the desert pressed down like a weight, broken only by the howl of coyotes or the crack of wagon wheels shifting in the sand. It was into this unforgiving world that the Oatmans ventured, a family of 7 children, their parents, and a dream of spiritual destiny. They were not alone. Dozens of families pushed west in the same years, each convinced they were chosen, each believing their suffering was part of a divine plan. For many, the harshness of the desert and the hostility of its inhabitants became overwhelming. For the Oatmans, the gamble would prove fatal. The American frontier was not merely a physical landscape. It was also a stage where cultures collided, where belief in providence clashed with the brutal reality of survival. In this environment, a single mistake could mean death, and yet, families pressed on, eyes fixed on a promised future that seemed just beyond the next horizon. Among them was Olive, still a child when the journey began, unaware that her life would become a parable for everything Americans feared and desired about the frontier. Among the countless families who dared the western frontier, the Oatmans stood out not because of wealth or power, but because of faith and stubborn conviction. They were ordinary in many ways, a father, a mother, and 7 children. But theirs was a family driven by a sense of divine calling that few could match. Royce Oatman, the patriarch, was a man of rigid determination. Born in Illinois, he had grown up in a world of restless movement, where new religious sects sprouted almost as quickly as cornfields. He had been drawn into one such splinter movement, a sect that emphasized separation from mainstream society and the creation of a purified Zion in the wilderness. To Royce, this was not merely doctrine, it was destiny. His wife, Mary Ann, was quieter in her devotion, but equally committed. She carried the heavy burdens of motherhood, 7 children, ranging in age from teenagers down to toddlers, yet never questioned her husband's vision. Her life was shaped by prayer, by the rhythm of household labor, and by the unshakable belief that their suffering had purpose. Among the children was Olive, born in 1837. She was in her early teens when the journey began. Olive was described as bright and observant, a girl who absorbed the words of her parents with a seriousness beyond her years. She helped care for her younger siblings, particularly her sister Mary Ann, who was closest to her in age and would remain her companion through everything that followed. The Oatman family's life in Illinois had been modest but secure. They lived on rented land, worked long hours, and relied heavily on their faith community. Yet Royce was never satisfied with a life that seemed so ordinary. When rumors spread of Western lands where faith communities could live apart from the corruptions of society, he grew restless. Preachers spoke of deserts that would bloom, of a Zion that awaited the faithful. For Royce, this was not only appealing, it was inevitable. And so in 1850, the Oatmans made the decision that would forever alter their lives. They sold their possessions, gathered their children, and joined a wagon train heading west. At first, they traveled with a larger group of settlers. The caravan included dozens of wagons, a moving village of families, oxen, and supplies. Together, they faced the endless miles of prairie and the daunting wall of the Rockies beyond. But Royce was not content to remain part of a crowd. He wanted to separate, to seek out his own destiny. His disagreements with the leaders of the train grew sharper with every mile. Eventually, his conviction led him to break away, to strike out on his own with his family. It was an act of faith or of folly that sealed their fate. By the time they reached the harsh deserts of Arizona Territory, the Oatmans were almost entirely alone. The vast, empty land stretched in every direction. The sun scorched their wagon canvas, water grew scarce, and the younger children weakened from exhaustion. Yet Royce pressed forward, convinced that the land ahead held the promise of divine reward. For Olive, the days were long and punishing. She helped her mother cook sparse meals over open fires, tended to the younger children, and tried to ignore the gnawing fear that crept into her heart. She saw the worry in her mother's eyes, the fatigue etched into her father's face. But she also saw something else, an unyielding determination, that nothing, not hunger, not fear, not even death, could turn them back. The Oatmans were no longer just a family on a journey. They had become symbols of a struggle larger than themselves, faith against wilderness, conviction against reality. And as the trail stretched ever farther, Olive could not have known that she was walking toward the moment that would transform her life. and etch her face into the memory of history. The desert had grown merciless by the time the Oatmans reached the region that is now southern Arizona. Their wagon creaked under the weight of dwindling supplies, and their oxen staggered across the rocky soil. Each day seemed longer than the last. The children's faces had lost their color, and Mary Ann, Olive's younger sister, often clung to her for comfort, whispering that she dreamed of rivers and green fields. On the horizon, the land offered no promise, only heat mirages and jagged mountains that seemed impossibly far. The Oatmans were alone now, entirely cut off from the safety of larger wagon trains, and in that isolation, they became vulnerable to dangers Royce had either underestimated or willfully ignored. It was on a late afternoon in March of 1851 that the family encountered a small band of native people along the trail. Accounts differ as to whether these were Yavapai or Apache. The records from the time are confused, filtered through fear and misunderstanding. What is certain is that the meeting quickly turned tense. The Oatmans, weary and desperate, may have hoped for aid, for trade, perhaps even for water. But suspicion clouded every word exchanged. The desert had taught both sides to trust no one. The Oatmans had little to offer, and Royce's refusal or inability to give more than he had may have been seen as insult or defiance. The moment of violence came suddenly. Historians would later piece together fragments of testimony: a demand unmet, a movement misread, a sudden clash that spiraled beyond control. The stillness of the desert erupted into chaos. Shouts echoed off the rocks, the terrified cries of children mingling with the sharp sounds of struggle. For Olive, it was a blur of fear and disbelief. She clutched Mary Ann's hand as the scene around her dissolved into nightmare. She saw her parents fall, her brothers struck down, her family's fragile world collapsing in an instant. In the space of minutes, the Oatmans' journey ended in carnage. When the dust settled, 7 members of the family lay dead or dying. Only 3 survived: Olive, Mary Ann, and their brother Lorenzo. But even survival carried no comfort. Lorenzo, beaten and left for dead, was abandoned on the trail, unconscious and bleeding. Olive and Mary Ann, terrified and trembling, were taken captive by the raiding party. The 2 sisters were forced to march away from the bodies of their parents and siblings, away from the shattered wagon that had carried their hopes across the desert. Each step carried them deeper into an unknown future, farther from everything familiar. The horizon they once believed held promise now marked the beginning of a captivity that would redefine their lives. The massacre on that desert trail was not just a family tragedy. It became a story retold in newspapers and sermons across the United States, a warning of the dangers that awaited settlers who strayed too far into hostile lands. But for Olive, in that moment, there was no wider narrative, only grief, terror, and the suffocating weight of loss. She had entered the desert as a daughter and a sister. She would leave it as a captive, marked by trauma, and destined to carry the memory of that day for the rest of her life. The desert night fell quickly after the massacre, a cold silence replacing the chaos of the day. Olive and Mary Ann, their hands bound, were led away from the blood-stained trail where their family had fallen. They did not look back. The sight was too unbearable, and their captors pushed them forward with sharp gestures. Every step felt like a betrayal of the home they had lost, yet survival demanded they walk. The sisters were exhausted. Their shoes wore thin against jagged rocks, their throats dry from dust and thirst. The raiding party offered little in the way of food or water. What small scraps were thrown their way were barely enough to keep them standing. The captors spoke in words the girls could not understand, their voices harsh and unfamiliar. Olive clung to Mary Ann, whispering prayers in broken sobs, desperate to hold on to some fragment of the life they knew. As the days turned to weeks, the reality of their situation sank in. The girls were no longer daughters in a family wagon. They were prisoners, traded among strangers, their future dictated by the shifting moods of those who held them. Olive noticed how her younger sister weakened with each passing day. Mary Ann's frame, already slight, grew thinner. Her steps faltered, and she often stumbled, unable to keep pace with the others. The nights were the hardest. Huddled together under scraps of cloth or exposed to the open sky, the sisters clung to one another for warmth. Olive tried to reassure Mary Ann with soft promises that they would be rescued, that Lorenzo might still be alive. that God would not abandon them. But inside, Olive wrestled with doubts. Her faith, so carefully nurtured in her father's teachings, strained under the weight of suffering. The captors, whether Yavapai or Apache as some accounts suggest, showed little mercy. They assigned the girls menial tasks, forcing them to fetch wood or carry heavy loads despite their weakness. When Olive faltered, a sharp shove reminded her of her place. Yet, she quickly learned that obedience was survival. She bowed her head, did as she was told, and prayed silently that Mary Ann would endure. Among the captors, Olive sometimes caught glimmers of curiosity. Women who looked at her pale skin and light eyes with quiet intensity. Children who pointed at her and whispered. She was both alien and captive, an object of fascination as well as burden. The tattooing ritual that would later mark her face had not yet come, but Olive already felt the invisible weight of being changed, of being seen as different. Mary Ann's condition, however, worsened. She often coughed through the nights, her breath shallow, her body trembling from weakness. Olive tried to share her own meager rations, pressing food into her sister's hands, even when her own hunger gnawed. She sang to her softly, old hymns their mother had taught them, the words of comfort floating into the cold desert air. What sustained Olive in those early months was not faith in her captor's mercy, nor even faith in rescue. It was the desperate determination to protect her younger sister, to keep at least one fragment of her family alive. But the desert was unforgiving, and captivity was a harsh teacher. Each day stripped away hope, leaving only endurance. For Olive, those first months were the crucible in which she learned the terrible truth of survival. That sometimes all one can do is hold on, step after step, praying that the horizon leads somewhere other than despair. By the time Olive and Mary Ann had spent months in captivity, their bodies were thin and frail, their clothes ragged from wear. Hunger and exhaustion had become constants, like the desert wind that never ceased its low whistle. But just as Olive thought she understood the rhythm of her new life, something occurred that would alter her appearance and her destiny forever. One morning, she and Mary Ann were led to the center of the settlement. The tribe's elders, along with several women, gathered in a circle. At first, Olive did not understand what was happening. The captors spoke rapidly among themselves, their words sharp and deliberate. She felt her sister's hand tremble in hers. Then she saw the implements being prepared. Small thorns, dark pigment made from cactus and soot, the kind of tools that suggested something ritualistic, something permanent. Mary Ann, too weak to resist, clung to Olive's arm, but Olive was pulled forward. She was held firmly by several women, her face tilted upward toward the unforgiving Sunday. Olive's heart pounded as she realized what was about to happen. The pain came swiftly, sharp pricks along the skin of her chin, the dragging sensation of pigment pressed into open wounds. She clenched her teeth, but could not suppress a cry. Tears filled her eyes as the markings spread across the lower half of her face, each line deliberate, each stroke embedding something indelible beneath her skin. The process seemed endless, and yet in reality, it lasted only minutes. When it was finished, Olive was released, her chin and mouth burning, streaked with lines of blue-black ink. In the tribe's culture, tattoos carried meaning. To them, such marks might signify belonging, protection, or the passage between life and death. For Olive, however, the tattoo was a branding, a transformation she had not chosen. It announced to the world that she no longer belonged to her people, that she carried the symbols of another nation upon her skin. When she caught her reflection in a piece of polished metal days later, the sight shook her. The girl who had once looked back from mirrors in Illinois, the child of a pioneer family, dressed in simple calico, was gone. In her place was someone unfamiliar, her pale face now crossed with dark, permanent lines. It was not merely her appearance that had changed, it was her identity. Mary Ann, spared the tattoo because of her failing health, gazed at her sister with wide eyes. To Olive, that gaze was almost harder to bear than the pain. In Mary Ann's look, she saw both recognition and estrangement, as if the tattoo had drawn a line not only on her skin, but between her past and present selves. Among the tribe, Olive's tattoo made her more visible. Children pointed, adults regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and approval. She was no longer simply a prisoner, she was something in between, marked with symbols that told one story to her captors and another to the world she had left behind. What Olive could not yet know was that this mark, burned into her flesh under a desert sun, would one day make her infamous in her own country. When her photograph was eventually taken, the tattoo would be the first thing Americans saw, the image that turned her into a living symbol of fear, survival, and the collision of two worlds. For now, though, the tattoo was simply a wound that would never heal, a reminder that she was no longer who she once had been, and that the path back to her former life had grown more distant with every passing day. The weeks following Olive's tattooing blurred into a haze of hunger, labor, and grief. Yet through it all, one presence gave her strength. Mary Ann, her younger sister, had always been at her side, the last fragile connection to their lost family. But captivity had been merciless, and Mary Ann's health was failing faster than Olive could bear to admit. The signs had been there for months. Her steps dragged more heavily than before. She coughed at night, her small frame racked by tremors that no warmth could soothe. Her appetite diminished until even the meager scraps given by their captors seemed too much. Olive shared what little she could, often going hungry herself in an effort to keep her sister alive. But the desert does not bargain, and each day Mary Ann's strength ebbed further away. Olive remembered the days in Illinois when Mary Ann had been lively, full of laughter. She remembered how they would sit together by the fire as their mother read aloud, or how they whispered secrets in their shared bed on cold nights. Those memories became daggers now, because each glance at her sister revealed how far Mary Ann had fallen from that bright, lively girl. The captors seemed to know she was slipping. They gave her fewer tasks, almost as if they had already accepted her fate. Olive fought against this silent surrender, urging her sister to keep walking, to hold on, to imagine that rescue was still possible. But in Mary Ann's eyes, Olive began to see something different, a quiet resignation, a readiness that Olive could neither accept nor understand. One morning, after a particularly long night of coughing and fever, Mary Ann did not rise. Olive shook her gently, calling her name, but her sister's body was limp, her breathing shallow. Olive cradled her, tears running silently down her face, begging her to fight, to live. For hours she remained there, whispering prayers into the still desert air. But by sunset, Mary Ann was gone. The loss hollowed Olive in a way she could never put into words. The world became colder, emptier. She had entered captivity with a companion, a piece of her past that kept her grounded. Now that tether had been cut, she was utterly alone. The tribe buried Mary Ann with little ceremony, laying her body beneath the hard desert soil. Olive remained by the grave long after the others had left, staring at the mound of earth that held not only her sister, but her last living bond to her former life. She pressed her fingers into the dry dirt, leaving faint marks as though trying to hold on to something that was already gone. That night, when Olive lay under the stars, she no longer whispered prayers aloud. The words stuck in her throat. She stared into the vast darkness above and felt only silence echoing back. Whatever faith she had clung to seemed distant, as unreachable as the heavens themselves. Yet survival demanded that she continue. Without Mary Ann, Olive had no choice but to endure alone. She learned to bury her grief beneath obedience, to bow her head, to let the days pass without resistance. But deep within her, the image of her sister's frail body, her final breath, and the grave left behind in the desert never ceased to burn. From that moment on, Olive's story was no longer just one of captivity. It was one of solitude, of a girl forced to stand alone in a world that seemed determined to erase every trace of who she once had been. After Mary Ann's death, Olive felt as though she had been hollowed out. The desert stretched endlessly before her, silent and indifferent, and the familiar warmth of her sister's presence was gone. She was alone, and for a long time, that solitude seemed unbearable. Yet paradoxically, it was in that loneliness that her transformation began. The tribe that had taken her captive did not abandon her. Instead, they began to draw her slowly into the rhythm of their daily lives. At first, Olive resisted her grief, kept her withdrawn, her eyes fixed on memories of home. But hunger and necessity broke down the walls of resistance. She learned to follow the women into the fields, to grind seeds into meal, to gather wood and carry water. Her hands grew calloused, her movements more practiced. Language, too, crept into her mind. Words she had once heard, only as harsh sounds began to take on meaning. She understood commands, then names, then fragments of conversation. In time, Olive could form sentences, her tongue shaping unfamiliar syllables that once felt alien. This shift unsettled her as much as it sustained her. Each new word she spoke seemed to pull her further from her past, binding her more tightly to the world she now lived in. The tribe's women showed her a kind of practical kindness. They taught her how to weave mats from reeds, how to prepare roots for food, how to survive the desert's merciless cycles. To them, Olive was no longer only a prisoner, she was a girl caught between two worlds, vulnerable but useful. Some saw her as a younger sister, others as a daughter to be absorbed into their community. For Olive, the paradox deepened. She began to feel moments of belonging, brief flickers of connection, when laughter broke out during work, or when she joined in communal songs around the fire. Yet at night, lying beneath the stars, she would remember her father's stern prayers, her mother's gentle touch, and Mary Ann's fragile hand in hers. The grief returned like a tide, and she wept silently, torn between two identities she could not reconcile. One of the tribe's older women became especially attentive to her, offering small gestures of care, a shawl against the cold, an extra morsel of food, a word of comfort. Olive found herself leaning on this surrogate figure, though she never forgot that her acceptance was conditional, that she was marked and different. Still, in the emptiness left by Mary Ann's absence, that care gave her strength. Over the months and years, Olive's appearance changed. Her skin darkened from constant sun, her hair grew long and coarse, her tattoo faded slightly but remained ever visible. To strangers, she no longer looked like the pale pioneer girl she once had been. She was becoming something in between, shaped by captivity, reshaped by survival. And yet, Olive never fully surrendered her memory of home. Beneath her outward adaptation, she guarded the image of her family, the hymns of her childhood, the stories whispered by her grandmother. These memories, though painful, anchored her. They reminded her of who she had once been, even as she walked deeper into a new identity she had not chosen. In this strange balance, half captive, half adopted, Olive learned the most difficult lesson of her life, that survival sometimes means becoming a bridge between worlds, even when neither world fully claims you. While Olive labored in the fields of her adoptive tribe, life beyond the desert moved on. Wagon trains still pressed westward, soldiers still patrolled the frontier, and settlements grew along rivers and mining camps. In this restless world, rumors carried faster than wagons, spreading from campfires to trading posts, from trading posts to newspapers. And in those whispers, a strange story began to take shape. Travelers spoke of seeing a pale-skinned girl among the tribes along the Colorado River. Some swore she had blue markings tattooed across her chin. Others claimed she spoke a strange blend of English and native tongues. To some, she appeared almost like a ghost, half-remembered glimpses of a figure that did not belong. By the mid-1850s, these rumors reached American settlements in California and beyond. The idea of a white girl living among so-called hostile tribes provoked both fear and fascination. Newspapers seized upon the whispers, spinning them into tales of captivity, savagery, and lost innocence. Headlines hinted at tragedy, but also at titillation, appealing to a society eager for stories that combined moral warning with spectacle. The image of Olive, though few had truly seen her, quickly became larger than life. For some, she was a victim to be pitied, a helpless child carried away by brutal hands. For others, she was a symbol of the dangers lurking on the frontier, a reminder of what could happen to any settler's daughter. And in darker corners of conversation, she was treated with suspicion. Had she gone native, abandoned her people, surrendered too easily? These contradictions were fed by the anxieties of the age. The frontier was more than a line on a map. It was a battleground of identity. White Americans feared being swallowed by what they did not understand, even as they were drawn to its mystery. Olive Oatman, unknowingly, had become a mirror for these fears. Meanwhile, in the desert, Olive herself remained unaware of the stories being told about her. She rose each day with the tribe's women, tended to tasks, learned more of their customs. Her world was measured by survival, not by the gossip of distant settlements. Yet the whispers grew, until even leaders in Western outposts began asking questions. Was there truly a white girl among the Mojave? Could she be rescued or reclaimed? To the settlers, her tattoo was the most haunting detail. It was said that the dark lines marked her forever, that even if she were found, she would never be the same. The tattoo became a symbol of lost purity, of a child marked by another culture. And so, Olive Oatman became not merely a person, but a story told and retold, embellished until she was less a girl and more a myth. By 1856, the rumors of a tattooed white girl living among the Mojave could no longer be dismissed as frontier gossip. Word had reached Fort Yuma, a military outpost on the Colorado River, where soldiers and settlers alike demanded answers. Could it be true that a child of the Oatman family had survived? And if so, what could be done to bring her back? It was at Fort Yuma that negotiations began. Leaders of the Mojave, who had long known Olive as one of their own, faced pressure to surrender her. Traders and intermediaries passed between the settlement and the tribe, carrying offers, threats, and promises. To the Americans, Olive was not only a lost girl, she was a living symbol of captivity, a chance to prove that no frontier tragedy was beyond redemption. For the Mojave, the decision was not simple. Olive had lived among them for years. She spoke their language, worked alongside their women, and bore the marks of belonging on her skin. She was not merely a prisoner. She had been woven into their lives. Some resisted the idea of giving her up, while others recognized the inevitability of the pressure mounting at their borders. Finally, after tense exchanges, the Mojave agreed to release her. Whether they did so willingly, reluctantly, or under duress remains uncertain. What is clear is that Olive was led away from the only community she had known since childhood, guided by men who promised to take her home. But what was home now? As Olive approached Fort Yuma in February of 1856, she carried the weight of years in captivity. She was 19 years old. Her body bore the tattoo that would forever set her apart, and her memories were scarred with loss. Soldiers and settlers rushed to see her as she entered the fort, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity, awe, and morbid curiosity. To them, she was the living proof of survival, the girl branded in the desert. Reports from the time describe Olive as solemn, her gaze steady but distant. She spoke in English again, though slowly, as if reaching back for words she had once known. When asked about her years among the Mojave, she gave few details. Perhaps she feared misunderstanding. Perhaps she feared betraying those who had, in their own way, kept her alive. The newspapers wasted no time. Within weeks, her story appeared across the nation. Some accounts painted her as a tragic heroine, rescued from savagery by the hand of civilization. Others hinted at darker suspicions, questioning how deeply she had assimilated into the tribe, whether she had been changed in ways too profound to erase. Olive herself remained caught in between. She had returned to the world of her birth, but she no longer belonged to it completely. The tattoo on her chin was not merely ink. It was a boundary line, a reminder of years that could not be undone. When strangers looked at her, they did not see the Illinois girl she had once been. They saw the myth, the branded girl, the living story. And so, Olive's return was not an ending. It was the beginning of another captivity. This time, not among tribes, but among the narratives others created for her. Olive Oatman's return to American society did not end her ordeal, it transformed it. If captivity among the Mojave had reshaped her body and mind, captivity in the gaze of the public now reshaped her identity. Almost overnight, she became a figure of fascination. Newspapers across the country printed her story, each account more dramatic than the last. Sermons invoked her name as a warning of the dangers of straying from faith or venturing too far into the wilderness. For a public hungry for stories of survival and morality, Olive was irresistible. But fascination came at a price. Strangers stared at her wherever she went. Some whispered when they saw the tattoo on her chin, calling it both a scar and a stain. Others treated her as though she were a holy relic, the living embodiment of divine deliverance. To Olive herself, it was suffocating. She had longed for freedom during captivity, but freedom here meant being trapped in other people's expectations. Soon, she was placed on stage, literally. With the help of ministers and writers, Olive was persuaded, even pressured, to share her testimony with the public. Lectures were organized in packed halls, where crowds paid to see the branded girl speak. She would step before an audience, dressed in the fashions of American society, her tattoo stark against her pale skin. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by silence as she began to recount her ordeal. The words were often not entirely her own. A minister named Royal B. Stratton quickly published a book about her captivity, crafted from her interviews but heavily shaped by his religious and moral lens. The narrative emphasized her suffering, her faith, and her ultimate redemption through return. It portrayed native tribes as savages, and Olive as a symbol of Christian endurance. The book became a bestseller, securing Olive's fame but also binding her to a version of her story she did not fully control. Night after night, she repeated that story before audiences, her face illuminated by gaslight, her tattoo unblinking under the crowd's gaze. People came not only to hear her words, but to see her body as evidence. The tattoo was proof that her suffering was real, that the wild frontier had indeed touched her. Some leaned forward in sympathy, others in morbid curiosity. To them, Olive was no longer just a woman. She was a spectacle, a moral lesson, and a warning wrapped in flesh. Behind the scenes, Olive struggled. She rarely spoke about the Mohav in ways that reflected the complexity of her experience. While she had endured hardship, she had also been cared for, taught, and given a place after losing everything. Yet the public did not want ambiguity. They wanted a simple story of captivity and salvation. So Olive remained silent about the parts that did not fit, allowing her life to be reduced to a parable. Her private self began to vanish under the weight of the public image. She could no longer walk down a street without being recognized, no longer exist without being interpreted. The tattoo that had once marked her as different among the Mohav now ensured she would never be ordinary among her own people again. The lecture tours filled halls and sold books. They gave Olive financial stability and fame, but they also deepened her isolation. Each time she told her story, she felt a little more distant from the girl she had once been, and a little more bound to the myth that America demanded she embody. In the crowded lecture halls, Olive Oatman appeared composed. She stood with dignity, her voice calm, her story rehearsed until it flowed like scripture. To the audiences, she was a survivor, a living testimony of faith and endurance. But when the crowds dispersed and the gaslights dimmed, Olive carried something that no book, no stage, no sermon could capture: silence. That silence was heavy, a silence filled with memories she could not speak. The world around her wanted a simple story. Savagery endured, faith preserved, civilization restored. But Olive knew the truth was not simple. Her captivity had been marked by cruelty, yes, but also by moments of care, of unexpected kindness. She had learned language, customs, and skills that had kept her alive. Yet to admit this would be to betray the story America demanded of her. So she did what she had always done to survive. She adapted, she spoke what was expected, withheld what was not. Each omission widened the distance between who she was and who she appeared to be. Privately, Olive wrestled with identity. She looked in the mirror and saw the tattoo that refused to fade, a constant reminder of years lived in another world. Sometimes she touched the lines gently, as though they still carried the voices of the women who had inked them into her skin. At other times, she pressed a cloth against them, wishing she could scrub the marks away. She rarely spoke of Mary Ann, though her sister's face haunted her in dreams. In public, Olive was the lone survivor, the heroine of redemption. In private, she was still the girl who had held her sister as life slipped away. That grief had no stage, no audience. It was hers alone. The contradiction of her life deepened with time. In parlors, women asked her questions in hushed tones. Did you suffer terribly? Were you treated as a slave? Did you ever think you would die? Men, meanwhile, studied her with unsettling curiosity, as if her tattooed face made her both exotic and untouchable. Olive answered politely, carefully, never straying from the script. But when the questions ended, she retreated inward, the silence growing heavier. Her faith, too, became complicated. The God she had prayed to in the desert, the God she had begged for her sister's life, had remained silent. In her lectures, Olive spoke of providence, of deliverance. In her heart, she wondered whether survival had been providence or simply chance. As the years passed, Olive longed for a life that was not a performance. She wanted to exist without being stared at, to walk without whispers following her. She dreamed of a home where she could be more than the branded girl, where her story could end in peace rather than spectacle. But the silence remained. It was the one companion she could never escape. In time, Olive stepped back from the lecture circuits. The endless retelling of her captivity had drained her, and the weight of being a public symbol left her weary. What she desired most was not applause nor fame, but the quiet dignity of an ordinary life. She found some measure of that when she married John B. Fairchild, a businessman from Texas who offered her stability and a chance at privacy. In him, Olive discovered something rare, a man who did not see her merely as the branded girl, but as a woman worthy of companionship. They settled in Sherman, Texas, where John's prosperity allowed Olive to live more comfortably than she had ever imagined possible during her early years. Their marriage did not erase Olive's past, but it softened its edges. She built a home, managed a household, and moved in circles of respectability. Neighbors described her as gracious, refined, even gentle. For the first time since her childhood, Olive had a place where she was not expected to perform, yet the past never entirely released her. The tattoo remained, unchanging, a visible reminder to anyone who looked closely. In social gatherings, she often wore veils or positioned herself in shadows, seeking to deflect curious stares. Though her friends admired her, whispers always followed about the desert, the captivity, the strange mark that made her unlike any other woman in town. Olive bore no children of her own, though she became a guardian and benefactor to orphans in her community. Perhaps this was her way of reconciling the loss of her siblings, a quiet tribute to the family she had been denied. In letters and in private conversations, she rarely spoke of her captivity, choosing instead to present the image of a composed, respectable matron. But fragments of the old Olive surfaced in subtle ways. She supported charitable causes with an intensity that suggested personal understanding of suffering. She remained guarded, cautious with strangers, as though the public scrutiny of her youth had taught her to protect her true self, and she carried within her an enduring sadness, a shadow that no comfort could entirely erase. In the years that followed, Olive's story faded from the national spotlight, but never vanished completely. Visitors occasionally traveled long distances just to glimpse her, to see with their own eyes the tattooed woman whose name had once filled newspapers. Some left disappointed, finding not the exotic figure of myth, but a dignified woman living an ordinary life. Others left more haunted than before, unsettled by the quiet resilience they saw in her. For Olive, this half-life was both blessing and curse. She had reclaimed a measure of normalcy, but she could never fully escape the past. The desert lived on in her memory, the tattoo lived on in her skin, and the story lived on in the minds of those who could never let her simply be a woman instead of a symbol. As the years lengthened, Olive Oatman Fairchild settled into a quieter existence in Sherman, Texas. Her life, once dissected in newspapers and whispered about across the frontier, now passed in the measured rhythm of small-town respectability. She devoted herself to charitable work, supporting orphanages and local causes, always careful to maintain an image of refinement. Yet those closest to her noticed that Olive rarely spoke of her early years. The desert, the Mojave, even the faces of her lost family, these were memories she kept tightly locked away. When pressed by acquaintances curious about her tattoo, she would politely deflect, offering vague answers. The stories she had told as a young woman on lecture stages seemed to belong to someone else, a figure she had played but no longer wished to inhabit. Still, the tattoo remained, its lines etched as vividly as the day they were made. In photographs taken in her later years, the markings are unmistakable, standing out even as her hair turned grey and her expression grew more solemn. For Olive, the tattoo was no longer just a reminder of captivity. It was the thread that bound together all the chapters of her life, from tragedy to survival to uneasy peace. Her marriage provided stability, but not freedom from her past. Friends respected her, neighbors admired her, yet whispers never ceased. Some saw her as a tragic heroine, others as a living relic of a vanished frontier. Olive, for her part, sought no such titles. She wanted only the dignity of being remembered as a woman who endured. On the 21st of March 1903, at the age of 65, Olive Oatman passed away quietly in Sherman. Her death was noted in local papers, but it did not command the national headlines that had once made her famous. She was buried beside her husband, her grave marked with modest simplicity. Yet even in death, Olive's story refused to fade. Writers continued to tell it, embellishing details, reshaping the narrative to fit new audiences. To some, she was the innocent victim of savage violence. To others, she was proof of endurance and divine providence. And to a few, she was a complex figure caught between two cultures. A woman who bore in her flesh the mark of a history Americans were still struggling to understand. In the quiet cemetery where she rests, her name endures not only in stone but in the myths that grew around her. For Olive, there was never true escape from the desert, from the tattoo, or from the gaze of a world that insisted on seeing in her story what it most desired or feared. More than a century after her death, Olive Oatman's face still stares back at us from that faded photograph. Her eyes are calm but unreadable, her posture rigid, her mouth framed by the dark blue lines of her tattoo. To some, the image is unsettling. To others, it is hauntingly beautiful. But for all who look upon it, it demands a question. Who was she, truly? History has offered many answers, each colored by the era that retold her story. In the 19th century, Olive was cast as a victim. Her tattoo, a mark of captivity and loss. Preachers held her up as a warning against straying from faith. Newspapers sensationalized her as the branded girl, an exotic figure both feared and pitied. In the 20th century, historians tried to strip away the myths, to recover Olive as a real woman, not just a symbol. They found contradictions, testimonies that suggested she was treated with cruelty, but also evidence of care and integration. They found her silence in later life, a refusal to relive what she had endured, and in that silence they found something truer than any published account, the right of a survivor to keep her own story. Today, Olive Oatman remains suspended between legend and history. She was at once a daughter of pioneers, a captive of the Mojave, a public spectacle, and a woman who longed for ordinary peace. Her tattoo, once seen as a scar, can also be read as a survival mark, a reminder that she endured when all else was taken from her. The photograph, more than words, preserves this complexity. Its grainy surface holds the weight of grief, resilience, and mystery. When we look into Olive's eyes, we are not only seeing a girl of the frontier, we are seeing the collision of two worlds, the fragility of survival and the stubborn persistence of identity. Perhaps this is why her story continues to fascinate. Olive Oatman embodies the contradictions of the American frontier, the dreams of settlers, the tragedies of conflict, the resilience of those caught between cultures. Her life reminds us that history is never just a record of facts. It is a tapestry of memory, myth, and silence. And so, as we close her story, we return to that single, unchanging image. A young woman, her face marked by ink, her gaze fixed on eternity. She lived only 65 years, but her photograph ensures that she has never truly vanished. The question, then, is not whether Olive Oatman still speaks to us. It is what we choose to hear when we meet her eyes.